Welcome to Podkey Daily News with the housing squeeze, AI power surge, and shifting Israel politics. Three stories set the practical agenda right now. Housing is getting harder to enter, AI is starting to reshape the power grid, and US politics on Israel is moving faster than the old consensus can keep up. The clearest pressure point is housing. Median U.S. home prices are now close to 5 times median household income, far above the old 3-to-1 affordability benchmark. You can see the result in who gets shut out. First-time buyers are down to about 21% of the market, and the average buyer is now around 40. The core problem is supply. Since 2020, the U.S. has built far fewer homes than it did across earlier decades, leaving an estimated shortage on the order of 15 million units. That matters because a lot of current policy talk still drifts toward financing tricks, when most economists say longer mortgages, even 50-year loans, won't fix a market that simply does not have enough homes. The stronger bipartisan push is to ease federal barriers and pressure or incentivize local governments to allow more construction. That's where to watch for actual movement. The deeper story runs back more than a century. The Homestead Act of 1862 handed out 160-acre claims for a small fee and 5 years of farming, and about 3 million people filed claims. It opened formal ownership to groups often excluded elsewhere, including single women and tens of thousands of newly freed Black Americans. But that transfer only happened after Native people were forcibly removed from the land being given away. Later, the FHA helped create the modern 30-year fixed mortgage, replacing short-term balloon loans and making stable monthly payments possible for millions of families, especially after World War II. At the same time, the FHA's redlining maps and racially restrictive development practices locked many Black families out of the same wealth-building system. So, the American housing model expanded ownership and entrenched exclusion at the same time. That tension still matters because today's affordability crisis is landing on top of old inequalities in who was allowed to buy, where, and on what terms. There's also a warning embedded in mortgage history. In the 2000s, lenders moved away from safer government-backed fixed loans and pushed adjustable rate, interest-only, and balloon products that looked a lot like the risky old loans FHA-era policy had replaced. When prices stopped rising, defaults and foreclosures spread fast, and roughly 12 million households ended up underwater. That is why demand-side fixes get so much skepticism now. Easier debt can juice prices, but it doesn't create homes. The next major practical shift is electricity. Analysts say U.S. power demand could climb as much as 25% by 2030, a sharp reversal after roughly 2 decades of flat demand. The driver is the rapid build-out of AI data centers, which are highly concentrated and extremely power-hungry. Utilities and investors are already putting serious money into generation and grid upgrades to serve them. That has fed a merger boom utility. M&A hit about $204 billion in just the first 5 months of 2024, roughly 40% above the prior year. The pitch is scale and capital. The concern is less competition and higher bills for customers. Watch regulators here. State commissions and federal scrutiny are uneven. Senators, including Elizabeth Warren, are raising alarms, and this deal wave could cool if approvals tighten or if the best targets are already gone. Another issue with direct consumer consequences is autos. U.S. officials are worried Chinese carmakers could use USMCA tariff preferences to route Chinese origin components into the North American supply chain. One proposed fix would require at least 50% of a vehicle's value to come from U.S. plants to qualify for preferential tariffs. The trade-off is cost. If policymakers go further and slap broad tariffs on cross-border parts, automakers' costs rise fast and buyers are likely to pay for it at the dealership. What matters next is whether the policy response stays targeted at origin rules or expands into a wider tariff fight that disrupts the regional manufacturing system itself. On foreign policy, the biggest political shift is inside the Democratic Party. High-profile figures including Rahm Emanuel, Gavin Newsom, and Pete Buttigieg are now moving from blanket support for Israel toward conditioning weapons and aid on human rights standards. The signal event was April's Senate vote, when about 40 Democrats backed efforts to block arms sales to Israel. That would have been far harder to imagine under the old bipartisan consensus. This is becoming a test issue for the party's next generation. For 2028 contenders, the question is no longer whether to discuss conditions, but how far to go. That political movement tracks public opinion. A March Pew poll found 60% of Americans now view Israel unfavorably, up sharply over the past few years, with the biggest shift among Democrats. Republicans are still more supportive overall, but even their younger voters and some conservative voices are showing more skepticism about open-ended backing and wider regional entanglements. Inside Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu is juggling domestic weakness, pressure around Iran diplomacy, and a more complicated relationship with Washington. Polling cited in recent reporting shows low Israeli trust in Donald Trump to protect Israel's interests in Iran negotiations. And in Gaza, the human and material reality is long-term. Residents and aid workers say rebuilding could take 10 to 15 years and cost billions, with repeated displacement shaping how people experience every political argument about aid, conditions, and reconstruction. One more case to watch closely is David Wood in Texas, where defense lawyers are pushing a wrongful conviction argument ahead of a narrow window to get intervention from incoming DA James Montoya. The allegations are serious. Police coached jailhouse informants, later cash payments totaling $13,000 to two informants. One dropped capital murder charge, and a sworn declaration from George Hall saying he gave false testimony under coercion and stayed quiet for 30 years out of parole fears. Defense counsel also says male DNA found on a victim's clothing does not match Wood. More than 100 items remain untested, and Texas authorities have repeatedly refused broader retesting. Why it matters is simple. This is a death penalty case where critics say the original jury deliberated for under 90 minutes before sentencing, and the core dispute is whether the system will allow fresh scientific review before it's too late. Those are the key moves with the biggest practical impact right now. This is Podkey Daily News. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.